Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. Thanks for joining us, and remember to subscribe for free on your favorite platform. My guest today is Louise Southerden, an Australian author and award-winning travel writer who has been Australia's Travel Writer of the Year a record 5 times and won the Australian Society of Travel Writers Responsible Tourism Award 6 times. On a gap year after studying psychology and zoology at university, she bought her first SLR camera and daydreamed of being a photojournalist. After being told she needed to write words to go along with her images, she completed her first travel story about a 3-month overland trip across sub-Saharan Africa in an ex-Army Bedford truck when she was 24, and her writing career was born. In the 25 plus years since then, Louise has specialized in nature-based adventure travel and visited some of the farthest flung corners of the world. She's been canoeing in Madagascar, trekking in Mongolia, kayaking in the Arctic as well as Antarctica, the Philippines, and Panama, hiking in Nepal and Reunion Island, and expedition cruising in the Galapagos, Iceland, and the Russian Far East. She has also lived in southern Japan for a year and a half, an experience that led to her first book, Japan, A Working Holiday Guide. A longtime surfer, Louise is also the author of Surf's Up, the world's first women's guide to surfing. Her latest book, titled Tiny, a memoir about love, letting go, and a very small house, is a deeply personal account of what ended up being the biggest adventure of her life, designing and building her own tiny house, while at the same time separating from her partner who is building the house with her. She has lived in her tiny house near Byron Bay, Australia, for over 4 years now. Welcome, Louise.
Thanks, Andrea. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited you're here today because we're going to explore what it really means to live on your own terms, how to be free, create a sense of home that truly reflects who we are, and build a life we can be proud of. Your story beautifully weaves all of that together in a powerful and inspiring way. From years of traveling the world to building a tiny house during a time of personal upheaval, you've carved out a path that's uniquely yours. And I want to start off with your career as a travel writer, some of the details of which I shared in the introduction. You've had the kind of adventures many of us only dream about. Where did this hunger to explore the world and live so fully come from?
I never actually had the goal or a dream of being a travel writer or even a writer. I think it just kind of unfolded naturally in a way. I think there were 2 things I noticed in myself fairly early on. And those 2 things were curiosity and a sensitivity to my surroundings. I think I felt when I was growing up that I didn't quite fit where I was in suburban Sydney. That probably was the impetus in the beginning for just looking at where else could I go and where else might I fit in. That's how I kind of fell into traveling. But then what kept me traveling, I think, is that curiosity. I've always wanted to understand the world. And when you travel a lot, every new place gives you another piece of the puzzle. Travel is like an endless masterclass in history, geography, psychology, sociology, politics, climate science. For me, because I was writing, there's something about having that pressure to produce work at the end of your trip that really forces you to pay attention. And that also just makes each experience even richer because you're really there. I was taking notes and interviewing people, and you're always looking for story angles and photos. Just having that sense of purpose and a job to do just really heightens the whole experience. And then that makes it more enjoyable. And it just became then this life that I guess I became a bit addicted to. I think when I was traveling, I felt more at home in myself and in the world than when I was actually at home. The more I traveled, the stronger that feeling became. Traveling just changes you little by little, and especially when you're doing the kinds of trips that I was doing away from familiar settings. I didn't really travel through Europe or North America much. It was often in quite remote places. People really did live quite differently.
On your blog, No Impact Girl, you said that what makes traveling so transformative is, and I'm quoting here, having my worldview changed on a regular basis, being tossed around in a sea of new experiences, disappearing into a new place. The more we travel, the more aware we become of world affairs, and the more we care about people whose lives might be affected by them. And you also wrote that being in a new place can wake us up to the world and clarify our place in it. Can you talk about a moment or a place that profoundly shifted your worldview or sense of self?
Each place was just adding another piece of the puzzle and helping me realize or understand where I fit in the whole scheme of things. The place that shifted my sense of self was probably Japan. I've been back a number of times since I lived there. Living there when I was in my late 20s had the most profound effect on me than anywhere else I've been. I think where I was in my life, that was just after my mum had died. I really felt that being a sensitive person was in Japan not just tolerated, but it was appreciated and valued. The whole sensibility of the culture is very different to the culture in Australia and perhaps in the US as well. Australia and the Western world has more of an extrovert ideal. I'm a big fan of Susan Cain's book about introverts called Quiet. That really resonated for me when I read it. And I think Japan is kind of generally an introverted culture. And I just found a different way to live there. I think I'd always been the good girl going from school directly to university and then into a corporate job. When I lived in Japan, I just felt I could just be happy just living day to day. I was teaching English and surfing on my days off, and I had this wonderful community of expats and Japanese people. I just felt this great sense of belonging that I can fit in somewhere. I think it's sometimes, like I said in that quote you read, that I really like disappearing into a new place. I feel like I'm jumping in the river of humanity when I'm traveling, a sense of being human in the world. When I went to Antarctica, I went from New Zealand, and so it's quite different from going from the tip of South America because it's 5 sea days from New Zealand down to the edge of the Antarctic continent. It was very rough. I get seasick, so I had to dose myself up with seasick pills. It was on a small ship. I think there were 100 passengers and plus crew. Probably the most remote place I've ever been. You're a long way from help. It was a luxury ship. It was like a floating 5-star hotel and everything was beautiful, the cabins and the food and everything. But if anything went wrong, there's no chance of rescue. You're in this vast ocean. It really does make you realize that we're just specks on this whole planet and that we're really not as important as we think we are. Lots of places have made me feel like I'm quite insignificant, which is really life-affirming in a kind of paradoxical way. Rafting the Franklin River was another one because that's just wild country. That's in Tasmania, bottom of Australia. Interacting with wild animals. I once went swimming with some minke whales on the northern end of the Great Barrier Reef in North Queensland.
Oh my goodness.
With cetaceans in particular, they really look back at you. You really get the sense that they're experiencing you as well. Those experiences just really stay with you. I'm really lucky that I also got to write about these things. I get to share those experiences with other people and not just have them affect my own life. I often would feel that I actually do my trips twice, that I'm doing them when I'm away and then I'm reliving them, and often more richly, because when I'm back at my desk, I'll be looking into the history of a place or realizing that I was on this hike in Nepal and we were going along the Gandaki Gorge, which apparently is the deepest gorge in the world. And I don't think I realized that when I was there. And then you can put that in your story, and then the people reading the story get that experience when they're reading it.
One of the recurring themes in your book is the meaning of home. Home as a place, home as a yearning, home as a sense of safety and belonging. Your family moved houses many times growing up. What impact did that have on you at the time?
I was never really a rebellious teenager or child, but this was something that I really felt strongly about even as a small child, that I really hated moving. I really resented the idea that home had become commodified. We didn't move cities. We were always moving around the same area of the same part of Sydney. I just hated that the value of home was diminished by putting an economic value on it and seeing it as an asset. And that's how housing is now. I always always just envied friends whose parents lived in the same house all their lives, and that stability as a place where people's memories built up. My dad's a very savvy investor, and so in the end, we did get to live in a beach house, and my brother and I could windsurf from the back garden up the inlet. And, I'm grateful for all that. I was very lucky to grow up in a privileged part of the world. But yeah, I think that's probably how I ended up living in a tiny house.
You mentioned your mother earlier, and you were in your late 20s when your mother was diagnosed with cancer. You write movingly that being with her in the final weeks of her life felt like a veil had been lifted. I could suddenly see everything more clearly, and everything unimportant fell away, leaving only what mattered. You also said that you wanted to hold on to that sense of aliveness and clarity for as long as you could, and that her death gave you a free pass to find out who you really were and to do something you'd never done before. You made a big life change at that point. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I was in this corporate job working in market research. I did that for about 6 years. I had a couple of years before I took a gap year. And then when I came back from traveling, I worked for another 4 years doing focus groups and using my psychology degree, really. There were so many times when I just thought, I kind of have to pretend that what I'm doing is important. We were doing focus groups on whether a certain chocolate brand should change the purple of their packaging or something. And it's like, really? I mean, okay, I have to do this job because I'm being paid to do it. And it's on some abstract level, it's interesting. But someone dying in front of you is really real. I just thought this is something I really want to hold on to, this sense of reality. At the time, I actually had a boyfriend who had been traveling back and forth to Japan a few times. So I went with him to Japan. We were surfers. We lived in this small town on the coast of Kyushu. It's one of the happiest times in my life. Just being there, I think I felt like I'd found my people. I had been writing a few travel stories before I went to Japan. So I had this kind of quiet seed of, I want to do something creative, but I don't know what that is. I was working a 9 to 5 job and I was trying to write travel stories in my free time, which was just not sustainable. And I just was extremely self-conscious reading published writers and trying to write like them, and I couldn't do it. I just felt really unsure of myself. But when I went to Japan, I felt more confident in myself. But also for the first 6 months, apart from a few books that I found in English, I had no contact with any English language media, which was really liberating. It's probably the equivalent now of going off social media for 6 months. Instead of just thinking about what I should be writing to write travel stories, I started just noticing what I naturally noticed about Japan. I was living in a very rural part. I was surfing, which a lot of people in Australia didn't know you could surf in Japan back then. So I got to write about the things that I was experiencing, and that's how I started writing travel articles for a foreigners magazine in Japan first, and then for some Australian publications. When I was leaving Japan, a publisher that I'd been writing articles for started a guidebook series and asked me if I would like to write a working holiday guide to Japan. I felt very daunted about writing a book. I knew so many more people, more expats in Japan who had lived there longer than I had. And I thought, I've only been here a year and a half. What do I know? But as I kind of realized, when you write a book, you often just have to have the curiosity to want to know more about it. You find out things that you then want to share with people. So that then kind of was another little nudge for my travel writing career when I came back, because I became temporarily a bit of a Japan expert. So that whole life change, which came about after mum dying, it really set me on the course of my life. And I often feel sad that mum never got to see that, because she loved traveling. She was a photographer as well. She used to do portrait photographs. She gave that up to have a family when she married dad. So her love of travel and photography somehow felt like it was coming out again through me. Maybe she's up there looking on my life and enjoying it.
You've said of that time that you chose freedom over security, and that as the years rolled on, you felt more at home when you were away than when you were actually in Sydney. Why was freedom so important to you at that point in your life?
I think I was terrified of being trapped in a life that didn't fit who I was. I didn't want to live the life my parents and so many of my peers had chosen. Sometimes I wish I did want that because in some ways it would have been easier. I just had this restlessness and this desire to create a life that suited me. I think that sense of feeling trapped in something that doesn't work, yeah, maybe that's why I've built my tiny house on wheels. You can get a sense of security and you can move your house. Looking back on it now, I do also think that traveling brought me a different kind of security as well as a sense of freedom because it made me realize that I could travel and live almost anywhere. I had a sense of purpose and a job to do when I was away, and that was quite an anchoring thing when I was in a group of people who were on a trip trekking or kayaking or exploring somewhere. I was the writer, the reporter, the scribe. I had this role and it was clear, so I didn't have to really establish my identity in the group.
So, fast forward 2 decades, and you were starting to feel burned out. You gave away most of your belongings, stored the rest, and went on the road. And on your blog, you describe the process of decluttering and downsizing as asking, what is enough and what is really essential for a rich life? Was that when you first started thinking about living a simpler life? Not just when you traveled, you already knew how to travel light when on a writing assignment, obviously, but also when you were back in Australia?
My desire to live a simpler life did come before that. Been living in the same share house for about 10 years at that point. So I was getting rid of a whole lot of stuff. And I was kind of the last man standing in the house. So I inherited a lot of other flatmates' couches and kitchen equipment and things. So I was getting rid of all that stuff too. But I think just the nature of freelance writing, I did get used to living quite frugally and quite simply just because I didn't have a lot of disposable income. And when I traveled, I think just seeing how other people live in other countries, especially in developing countries, and also just living out of a backpack, having only a few things and realizing that that's actually okay. I don't need 4 pairs of jeans. I can have one pair and I can have one pair of shoes. It's really freeing, it's really liberating, and you don't have to waste time in your day deciding what to wear. For a lot of people, that brings them joy. That's fine. But for me, I think the simplicity of just having this one outfit to wear and putting it on and then getting on with your day is really lovely. There's something else I didn't mention in the book. I was a Zen student for about 8 years in Sydney, getting into the teachings of the Dharma and the Buddha. That also, I think, influenced some of my sensibilities in terms of living humbly and simply. So when I did get burnt out, I was trying to find another place to live, but I couldn't find anywhere affordable to live. So that's when I kind of ended up packing up everything I owned and I went on the road traveling for 18 months. I was a bit lost, really, to be honest. I was trying to find where I possibly could live, and I ended up staying in each place as long as I could, often for a few weeks or a month. I was searching for something. At the end of that, I ended up having 2 weeks in a cabin in Norway alone and had a bit of an epiphany there.
A wonderful passage in your book is where you describe at the cabin doing things like splitting logs with an axe, boiling water for tea, mending clothes worn from months of constant travel. And you said that your days fell into a simple, satisfying routine and that everything could take as long as it needed to take. Why do you think moments like these, grounded in simple physical tasks, can have such a profound effect on how we feel and how we experience our lives?
That cabin was incredible. No running water, no electricity, no internet. It's those times in our lives when things are really stripped away that we often see what's important. I think it's kind of mindfulness 101, really. These tasks slow us down and they return us to our senses and our bodies. We have so much emphasis on our minds and thinking. This is our Western culture, really. And we often dismiss our body's wisdom. We evolved to move and experience the world around us and interact with our surroundings in a physical way, touching it, smelling it, looking at it.
And that brings me to something else you wrote in your book around this time in the cabin, which was walking barefoot in the forest, and that you said it slowed you down and opened you to a world of sensations otherwise out of reach. There's something almost primal about that. Do you think we're all longing, even if only subconsciously, for that kind of connection with the natural world?
I do. The way we live is so new, really, in terms of the whole of human history. We're losing this connection with nature that is so important. We belong in nature and we are nature. This whole separation from the natural world is a huge part of all the problems we're facing. This sense that we can just keep taking from the planet without any consequences, seeing it as separate from us. I mean, it's at the basis of a whole lot of global injustice, the exploitation of the global south by the global north. So many of these things come from this sense that the world is there for our use without really putting anything back or nurturing it. Our bodies evolved to listen and pay attention and notice changes around us. I interviewed this acoustic ecologist once, and he's been part of Quiet Parks International. He actually said that hearing is actually our most dominant sense. We often don't pay attention because we often in the modern world have to block off our hearing because we're in noisy environments. And so then I guess the visual sense becomes more important. He really helped me tune into listening to the world around me. And this is, I think, why I really want to live in quiet places now, where I can hear the slightest change in cicadas or birds, the wind in the trees. Living in a tiny house really does connect you to your outside world. And so I can feel like I can be in my house, but also aware of what's going on outside. This whole thing also was part of why I specialized in nature-based travel, because I wanted to keep reminding people and myself how amazing the world is and how much a part of it we are.
What's interesting about that is in your writing, you've introduced the world and experiences to readers. But to do that, you had to travel somewhere and often by plane. In your book, you mentioned that you really wanted to try to live more sustainably by traveling less overall. You said you wanted to focus on finding the right balance between traveling to make a living and staying home to make a life.
I really did feel that growing guilt about my carbon emissions from flying around. And before COVID, I definitely was trying to do fewer trips and write more stories from each trip so that I could fly less. I was offsetting my flights for a long time, and then I just realized that really doesn't do anything except just make me feel a bit better. It doesn't take the emissions out of the air. So many offset schemes are flawed in really important ways. And I guess there's also the argument that individual action maybe doesn't make a difference, that there are bigger forces than us that really need to be turned around. Some of the biggest polluters in the world are trying to get individuals to monitor our carbon footprints, where they continue to pollute and are supported by governments all around the world. There's also this sense of living with integrity and aligned with your own values. On a personal level, I did try to fly less. And yes, living simply. That's when I did start to think of how can I have a small, simple dwelling. I didn't own any land. That was always a big problem. I did some courses on natural building and looked into earth ships and straw bale houses. You go on YouTube, there's so many stories of people building houses out of recycled windows for $10,000. It's incredible what people can do, but you've got to have somewhere to put it. And so when I heard about tiny houses on wheels, houses built on trailers, I just thought, oh, yeah, I could pay some rent to someone to park it on their land. I thought small footprint, they require fewer materials and less energy than a regular house. They're defined slightly differently in different places. Here in Australia, I think the official definition is that they're movable dwellings with a floor area of less than about 50 square metres, designed for permanent living. My tiny house is about 25 square metres, including my 2 lofts. It's about 7 metres long, 2.5 metres wide, and quite high. So the height obviously gives it that sense of spaciousness. In the US, I think tiny houses have to be under 37 square metres, which is about 400 square feet. We talk about tiny houses on wheels. They can also be on skids where they can be picked up and put onto the back of a truck to be transported. So I bought a purpose-built tiny house trailer. I did a tiny house building workshop. The people who are doing the workshop make tiny house trailers, so I bought a trailer from them. And that was probably the single most expensive part of the tiny house. It was about $15,000, I think.
Australian dollars.
Australian dollars. Yes, that's right. The whole build ended up costing about 80,000 Australian dollars, which was a bit over what I thought I was going to spend, but much less than it would be now because building materials have gone up in price so much when COVID happened. In March 2020, when all the borders shut down and I couldn't travel for work because my work was affected, my job was affected, I got a government wage subsidy. I had a regular income every month thanks to the Australian government, and I had time because I couldn't work. That's when I started designing my tiny house. That took about 5 months, I think, before we started building.
You took a couple of workshops, but you didn't have any building skills before that. You, in fact, didn't even have a parking spot. How did you talk yourself past the practical objections?
I always loved reading adventure stories, especially of solo women doing things that were hard. I wanted to have one of these adventures that really cracked you open and showed what you were made of. And I always wondered what my big adventure might be if I was lucky enough to have one. And so, in a way, all those objections actually made the tiny house project seem more appealing to me. It had to be hard, it had to be something really different to what I'd done before. I was also planning to build it with my partner at the time, Max, and our relationship was quite rocky even at the start. So even the prospect of building the tiny house with him kind of felt a bit risky. And I do love that definition of adventure as a risky undertaking of uncertain outcome. I really wanted to be tested, and it really did end up being the biggest adventure of my life, as much for the physical aspect of building as from the psychological elements of the build with my partner. That was just definitely very trying.
You've said that to design a tiny home, you have to examine your life deeply. What did that process of designing your home, every choice, every square meter with your own hands and seeing with your own eyes, the house going from mere idea to physical reality, teach you about self trust?
I love this question. I mean, I often feel like the tiny house is me. So much of it is how I want to live, my preferences in terms of how I want my home to look. I wanted it to be inspiring to me and keep me moving forward and growing as a person. Looking at your own life for a purpose like this, it does force you to trust yourself. I should say here, perhaps, that the tiny house was always going to be my home, not a home for me and Max. He already had a house, but he did invite me to build it with him in his driveway, which was extremely generous, and I'll always be grateful to him for that. So he gave me a place to build it, and he also had a lot of the tools, and he was quite an experienced woodworker. Designing your home, it's something that I almost wish everybody could do because you really do learn about yourself. Even before I dreamed of having my own home, I just lie in hotel rooms and just look around and think, I don't need much more than this.
Before I forget, I want to let listeners know that if they want to see what your finished tiny house looks like, you were recently featured on the international YouTube show, Living Big in a Tiny House. Go and check out Louise's home. It's lovely. There's a beautiful part in your book where you write words like love and peace inside the floorboards and walls of your house. Tell us about that.
That happened quite early in the build, I think in the second week. Even at that stage, there was quite a tricky dynamic on the build site. Apart from Max and I having a bit of a up and down relationship, one of his best friends, George, who's a retired builder, also came onto the build site for the first 2 or 3 months, just a few days a week, to help us with some of the structural components, like making the floor, making the frame and putting that up, putting on the roof, putting in the windows, doing the cladding. So some of those really essential things that we wanted to get right because neither Max nor I were qualified builders. At the start of the build, I knew almost all there was to know about tiny houses, I thought, anyway. I'd watched thousands of tiny house videos, I'd done the workshops, I'd done a bit of woodworking, and I'd spent 4 or 5 months designing my tiny, drawing it up. But George was a retired builder. He'd had about 40 years of experience, built houses, but he'd never built a tiny house. And there are a few structural differences. For one thing, tiny houses have to be very lightweight, and there's a few other things. And then in between the two of us was Max, who was George's best friend and my partner. I often didn't know which hat to wear. It was my project and my adventure, and I was footing the bill for everything, paying for all the materials. I was also paying George for his time. But I was also a complete rookie, an apprentice, and I didn't know anything really. Our roles weren't really set. Because of that tricky dynamic, I often felt like they would take over and I'd feel excluded. And I think after the first week, George actually told me off for asking a question. I wanted us to be all doing it together. This is how I started writing words on the plywood subfloor. First in this sticky adhesive called Sikaflex, which comes out of a tube. I started writing words like love, and then I started writing other words like kindness and generosity and joy. So I started writing those words, and it was just incredibly steadying, and it just kind of returned the project to me in a way, and something that I could hold on to. I think about a month later, I invited a few friends over one Saturday afternoon and gave them all felt pens and crayons and asked them to write words of goodwill and good luck and all that stuff on my bracing ply. And that was also really beautiful.
We mentioned that one of the big themes in your book is the meaning of home. Has your definition of home settled, or is it still evolving?
I think it's still evolving. I love my tiny house. It's beautiful. It's comfortable. It was designed just for me. It kind of helps me live in the way that I want to live. Often at night, I'm woken up by the moon. I'll be reminded of things outside. Sometimes in the morning, like this morning when I woke up, I could hear all the birds and the sky was changing color. I really love living in it. It really slows me down. So that to me is what home is. I just think home has to fit who you are and who you want to be. I think my sense of home actually includes other people a lot more now. I think it's much more inclusive of a sense of belonging and having healthy relationships and a community around me. I think my sense of community is evolving as well. I think there's a sense that a community has to be a big group of people, but as a sensitive, introverted person, it can just be a few people, and that's often enough for me. Maybe as you get older, you become more confident in seeing yourself and not trying to fit yourself into the life you think you should be living. I'm planning to live in the tiny house for a long time to come.
For someone who feels stuck in a life that doesn't feel quite right, what would you suggest they do to start building a life that is true to who they are and how they want to live?
Building a life that's true to who you are involves knowing who you are. That's often what we don't put time into because there's so many forces around us pushing and pulling us in different directions. My suggestions would be things like finding space in your life to ask yourself questions, whether that's by going off social media for a day or a week or going offline completely. I often have time on Sunday afternoons where I go and take my notebook and go and sit on a headland looking at the sea for a couple of hours and write or just look and just let things settle and just try to reset my compass maybe. It's just waking up to what makes you feel alive. Just noticing even in your daily life, waking up that awareness. I still keep a journal, I guess like a gratitude diary. For everyone, it's about what makes you feel alive. And it doesn't have to be big things. Your life doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to please anybody else but you.
Where can people find you online to learn more about your work?
I have a blog, noimpactgirl.com. I also have a No Impact Girl page on Facebook that has more current things about my book and events and things like that. The blog and the website has some of my past travel stories. That's probably the best place where people can read about my travels. And then my book, Tiny, is available on Amazon in the US, in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And it's available, I think, in independent bookstores.
Louise, thank you so much for having taken the time today.
I've really, really enjoyed this interview. It's got to be one of my favourite interviews ever. Thank you for giving me a chance to share my experiences with people.